Hello YouTube. Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin had an apparent interest in UFOs and sightings and encounters to the extent that he invited some of the top scientists of his country to give an assessment. But let's start at the beginning. Valery Pavlovich Burdakov, a well-known Soviet scientist, had been in touch with me in the early 1990s and some years later. And he had an account of the meeting between Stalin and those who had to give their estimate of the danger of the UFOs for the USSR. There was a very interesting article, by the way, written by Vladimir Logovsky, one of Russia's best journalists and still active today. His article appeared in 1992 in the newspaper Не может быть, published in Moscow. I also had an account from Burdakov, and there was another one published also in 1992 in a now defunct magazine called Terminator. But the story basically goes like this, as told by Professor Valery Burdakov, by the way, who was a PhD of engineering sciences and associate of the Scientific Geoinformational Center and co-author of the immensely popular book Rockets of the Future. Now, before we get into this, please understand that originally Burdakov heard this story from Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. Korolev was one of the most remarkable individuals who helped push humanity towards space exploration. The Soviet military dictionary, encyclopedic dictionary, from 1986, from the Defense Ministry of the USSR, described Korolev as follows. He was a Soviet scientist, designer of rocket space technological systems, founder of the applied science of space travel, twice hero of socialist labor, academician of the Academy of Sciences USSR, graduated from Moscow Technical College in 1929, and from 1930 he was a senior engineer at the Central Aerodynamical Institute. From 1933 he was deputy director of the Jet Propulsion Scientific Research Institute, head of the Rocket Aircraft Section. During the Great Fatherland War, deputy chief designer at the Experimental Design Office. Under Korolev's guidance, ballistic and geophysical missiles had been created. First, artificial Earth satellites and artificial Sun satellites. Various purpose satellites. And he was recipient of the Lenin Award. The dictionary, however, is silent about several episodes of Korolev's life, and less than candid about his exact whereabouts during World War II. He was a slave in the Stalin's concentration camps, and he was almost killed. He was crippled, and that's one of the reasons he died early. But let's get back to UFOs, because it's important and it's history. Now, Burdakov worked for 32 years in Korolev's design bureau. And in his later years, he had participated in the creation of the Energia Buran complex. That's the Soviet shuttle. And there was a reason as to why Korolev initiated his conversation with Burdakov that eventually expanded into the knowledge of Stalin's interest in the anomalous phenomena. Korolev was a Soviet rocket designer, was also an official. And he received informants' reports that Burdakov kept on presenting lectures about flying saucers to other employees. Not only did Korolev not punish Burdakov, but he actually sent him to the Pulkovskaya Observatory and gave him a letter of recommendation. In those years, people told astronomers of UFO sighting episodes. In my future articles, I'll tell what Burdakov found at the observatory. Korolev did not reveal too many details of his meetings with Stalin. It was Tikhon Rabov who actually later in the later years, provided Burdakov with all the details of that historic meeting. In the late 1940s, the date is given as 1947, but I'm not completely sure this is the right date. But it says that Korolev was called upon and informed that it was per Comrade Stalin's requests that he was needed at the Kremlin. When he came there, Korolev was given 2 female translators, a pile of foreign newspapers, books, and 3 days to complete the job. This was the time in the United States when rumors swarmed about an alleged capture of a saucer near Roswell, New Mexico. There were many published reports, as well as documentary testimonies in that pile that Korolev looked at. Among the materials, there were also reports of sightings over the USSR. Korolev asked if he could take everything home with him, study the materials quietly and thoroughly, and consult experts. He was told no, and instead was provided with a special apartment for his work inside the Kremlin. So in a few days, he was again summoned before Stalin. The dictator asked for Korolev's opinion. Korolev replied that in his view, UFOs are not weapons of some potential adversary and do not pose a serious threat to the country. However, the phenomenon itself does exist, he said, and the time will come when it will have to be studied. Stalin told him, "Thank you, Comrade Korolev. Besides yourself, I had inquired with other eminent specialists. They held similar opinions." Burdakov thought that the distinguished Soviet scientists such as Kurchatov, Topcheyev, and Keldysh had been given similar assignments. Now, Korolev did not mention whether there were any other materials besides the books in the pile. We know that there were other reports that he was given, and I'm sure definitely had to be espionage reports and so forth. The other version of his meeting mentions that there was Donald Menzel's book about flying saucers. And that's what was very interesting, because in 1961 in the USSR they actually translated a book by this debunker, and it was one of the ways for the Soviet population at least to find out what UFOs were. There is another interesting footnote to the whole story. After his meeting with the Soviet dictator, Korolev became an ardent supporter of Alexander Kazantsev's idea that the Tunguska meteorite could have been an alien spaceship. Alexander Kazantsev himself, he was a somewhat mysterious person. He was a famous Soviet scientific writer, himself an ex-colonel, head of a military plant, and somebody who had spent time in New York in 1939 at the International Expo. And he didn't go to prison, which in itself was very remarkable. He wrote fabulous scientific fiction books, and sometimes some people questioned the knowledge that he had and where it came from. Now, back to Korolev. Not only did Korolev encourage his employees to conduct search of the object that exploded over the taiga in 1908, but according to some reports, he himself organized one of the expeditions. And I already had a video about late cosmonaut Grechko and his participation in the expedition. There was a very interesting confirmation also back in 1992 in an article published in a Yaroslav newspaper called the Tunguska Explosion. And it stated that Korolev, a distinguished designer of spaceships, did not exclude the possibility that an alien spaceship conducted maneuvers over the Siberian taiga. As was recently revealed at the time, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev was one of the first organizers of the helicopter expedition to the area of the Podkamennaya Tunguska. Smirnov was the head of the Yaroslav UFO research group, and he was very active in the years past. He was a well-known Russian scientist too, and an author. So these people that present information are not somebody who wants to give fake news. Those were serious people. And by the way, in his interview with Lagovsky, Burdakov mentioned that Korolev personally experienced UFO sighting over the Baikonur Cosmodrome or spaceport in 1962. The engineers who accompanied the rocket designer reported that a UFO that was observed was a disc-like object in the center of a spiral cloud. It had 4 rays aimed downwards from the hull. Korolev also, and very briefly, mentioned in his memoirs a strange place, a very interesting, mysterious laboratory for the study of the UFOs, or the flying saucers. And soon I will make a video about another remarkable person, very well known to those who study Soviet UFOs, and somebody who lived in the United States for a while until he was kidnapped by the Soviet secret police and brought back home. His name was Lev Sergeyevich Terman, and again, he was a well-known Soviet inventor in the first half of the 20th century. He mentioned existence of such a laboratory in his 1990 interview for Radio Magazine, issue number 8. Okay? Like many other prominent scientists, Terman was arrested by the secret police and placed in what we call in Russian sharashka, or a prison for scientists whose brains could be cheaply utilized for the good of the state. He was fortunate enough to find himself at the famous prison design center of Tupolev, the one that created famous Soviet Tu aircraft. And while in the sharashka, Terman met Tupolev's assistant, Korolev. This is very interesting. As I mentioned before, Burdakov had very interesting views on UFOs, ufology, Soviet state secrets, conspiracies, and other worthy subjects. He is respected equally by scientists and ufologists. He was a generous man who provided myself with much data, and I provided my files to him on the so-called Nazi UFOs. He was one of the few people in the USSR who definitely knew something about the German discs. Now, Burdakov also was involved in the design of several disc-like aircraft. Russia should take pride in scientists like Burdakov. Now, there is another story I want you to know. I often mention it in my lectures, but it never stops amazing me and those who listen to it. Among those classified documents that he had an access to, there was one dated in the middle 1950s, which was of particular interest to him. The report that Burdakov studied was written by some very serious people, Soviet academicians. It concerned a fragment that had a crystalline structure and reminded its shape of a blunted rectilinear cone. The object was obviously of artificial origin. The scientists could not understand its nature or its purpose. Their conclusion was unambiguous. The material is not from the earth. Today, said Burdakov, the conclusion would be a different one. After all, microchips are well known to people around the world. There is something else that I should mention about Stalin before I finish this video. Stalin was very much interested in aerial phenomena. Valentin Psalomshikov, a well-known Russian journalist who specializes in the paranormal, was able to discover a most interesting fact. Stalin was very much interested in meteorology. The Geophysics Institute of Georgia, country of Georgia, has kept original certificates of barometer probes taken by Iosif Djugashvili, who later assumed a more familiar name to the people of the Soviet Union, whose last name became Stalin. Moreover, as was described in Psalomchikov's article in 1997, there was an occasion when Stalin and his trusted assistant Uspensky took a stroll outside of Kremlin. The assistant, who was a general at the time, and the Soviet dictator walked in an area outside of Moscow when they noticed a round aperture in the clouds above Dmitrovskaya church. This opening or aperture would not be concealed even when the sky was completely covered up by clouds. They tried to find an explanation of this phenomenon, but could not. Uspensky claimed that Stalin was so impressed as to come to the same area regularly to watch the sky. Too bad the UFOs did not kidnap him at that time. Less people would have been killed in the Gulag, and the Soviet Union might have taken another way for its development. Thank you.